I think for many of us as improvisers, finding classic sounding phrases that also have some harmonic depth and interest is a big part of where we invest our practice time. With that in mind, today we're looking at 3 different levels of applying the altered scale and the sounds it can help us create in our solos. All right, level 1. Before we even get any music theory or any of that kind of stuff to think about what the altered scale is, you can actually access these sounds relatively readily by just looking at what some of the greats played using this sound. Some of these quote-unquote cliches that we might think are kind of wrapped up in this chunk of harmony. There are many of these. However, for me, the thing that really captures that sound is interacting with the flat 13 on a dominant chord. You'll find ideas really similar to this very straightforward 2/5 in a ton of solos and a ton of tunes. What's really going on here is, like I said, it's all about getting to that flat 13 on the 5 chord. That's really one of the things that makes it altered. So for here, if we're looking at this look and sort of breaking it down, we can see that I arpeggiate up the 2 chord, and the key thing is here that I get to the E natural, the 9 of the 2 chord. That wants to resolve down a half step to the E flat, which is the flat 13 of the 5 chord, and then eventually wants to resolve down another half step to the 9 of the 1 chord. So that little bit of resolution where we have those half steps moving down, regardless of what else is going on around it, that is really the sound of this lick and one of the clearest ways to access altered. Now, if you want a few more of these sort of lick-based ideas that can get you started on finding some of the cliche things or common things that people play on the altered scale, be sure to check out the free PDF over on the Patreon page. Check it out in the link. There are just a handful of those there this week to kind of get you going on some of that stuff. Cool. On to level 2. So let's actually get into some of the actual scale knowledge of this sound. When I am thinking about the altered scales, a couple different ways you can build it. I really like to think in terms of alteration. So we're looking at G7 today. So I would think about what alterations are present in a G7 alt chord. So that is a scale that has a root, a flat 9, a sharp 9, a major third, a sharp 11, a flat 13, and a flat 7. Now, you can see I've written some of these accidentals in maybe a slightly unusual way, considering that I'm thinking in G. We'll get to that in a second. This is my preferred approach, is to really think I'm in a G, area. G is the root, and I want to think how those alterations play off of that in a general sense. The other way that is very common to think about this, not necessarily my preferred approach, it's not wrong, it just doesn't necessarily resonate with how I approach harmony as much, is by thinking about what is called a parent scale. So we've got to think about, where does G7 alt actually come from? It is a mode of melodic minor. And so we need to think, what is the 7th step, G is the 7th step of what melodic minor scale, because altered is based off the 7 steps. So that is going to be the A melodic minor scale. So I'm kind of working backwards. I know I want G7 alt. I've got to think G is the 7th step of what melodic minor scale. That's why I chose to write these accidentals in kind of a funky way, so we could see, as I put these 2 examples up, that there is a connection between those 2 things. When we're playing G7 alt, we're really playing A flat melodic minor. It doesn't necessarily resonate for me as much, but it is a very common way to think about this and an absolutely essential way to understand what is going on with this sound. Now, once you practice this scale in sort of a basic sense, you can start to think how it actually works in tunes. Altered almost always is going to be 5-1. So we can practice some resolutions where we want to apply 5-1 and thinking about things like voice leading, how I construct lines. The great thing about this scale is that if you are playing through the altered scale in eighth notes and you get to that 1 chord, resolution is almost always going to be relatively close to where you are in that altered scale. You may have to sometimes add an enclosure, possibly an extra half step, or you might need to make a jump in the scale and then resolve back up or something like that, but very, very clear. So to practice this, I would literally just start on any of the scale notes, decide to descend or ascend, and look for that resolution when it needs to happen in the next measure. As you can see, some of them resolve easily, where you're just moving down the scale and then that resolution point comes, you move to the next note down or next note up. But some of them you will have to add an extra note in there. For example, the third one that I played, at the end of that line, I was approaching an A flat on the downbeat of 4. And in my brain and in my ear, I know I'm getting to C major coming next. I want to think, all right, well, what is close there as far as a chord tone that I can resolve to? G is right there, so I added an extra note below G to come back up, just a little enclosure. So having some of those enclosure and passing note skills will really help you apply some of this stuff in a smooth way, but generally this scale can really lead to some nice smooth voice leading from 5 to 1. These scale ideas can work their way right into your playing by just applying them when you get to the 5 chord. So if we put this into a long 2-5, we can almost play whatever we want on the 2 chord, anything that we think is going to sound good on the 2 chord, and think about what note in the 5 chord from the altered scale do I want to start on, move up or down that scale looking for resolution in the same way that we just did. As we can see in that line I just played, 2 chord has something pretty classic on it, but I get to that flat 13 on the 5 chord, just straight down the scale, looking for where resolution can happen. I'm on an E flat on the end of 4. Now I'm not necessarily thinking so technical like that, I'm really breaking it down here, but I'm thinking that I'm moving through the scale and I know when that next resolution, or that next chord is coming, I should say, and I'm adjusting my line either up or down to fit into the next chord as I get there. Once you've got a good handle on some of these foundational items, building some vocabulary around this sound, making sure you understand the music theory, then you can really get into some of the interesting stuff. This sound of altered in this scale has a lot of other little embedded patterns in it. As we mentioned, we know it comes from A flat melodic minor. So rather than just thinking about G altered, you could superimpose A flat minor ideas on top of that 5 chord to get some interesting results. In addition, this scale also really contains the essence of playing a tritone sub. So when you get to G7 alt, rather than thinking in G or thinking of that scale, maybe you think about D flat ideas, specifically D flat major or D flat dominant ideas, and superimposing those on top of the G sound. As you start to stretch the harmony a little bit in this way, and you're really superimposing things on top of other changes, it's really important that the ideas you're superimposing are clear. So this lick, for example, has mostly almost like a triadic or major pentatonic sound in the key of D flat. That makes it sort of like very simple and clear in D flat, so when I'm putting it on top of G, it sort of sounds in relief of the harmony. We kind of hear it as like something else, and then we resolve back to C, it sort of feels nice. It's that tension release that we want to get happening, and that's where these other structures, where we are forcing them on top of the chord in a way, are very, very effective. And finally, if you know that D flat major works on a G7 chord, you could also think about D flat's relative minor. And this is one that I really love to employ, is thinking about, in this case, a B flat minor pentatonic on top of G. So I would be thinking about, I'm building a minor pentatonic off of the flat third, and using that either over a longer chunk of a dominant chord, or in this case, just over a 2-5. It can really lead you to some really interesting ideas, particularly if you employ some of the more intervallic aspects of playing the pentatonic scale. All right, there you have it. 3 different levels of altered. Now, you don't want to just think, haha, I'm going to apply the altered scale and I'm suddenly going to sound hip. You actually have to have some stuff together on it. I know when I was a younger musician, I spent too much time practicing in a way that didn't really get me connected with sort of the melody and the voice leading and the sound of altered. I just thought if I played the altered scale, I would sound killing. And it just doesn't really work that way. You have to really think about how this is going to serve you melodically, possibly in a voice leading standpoint. If you're doing some of this superimposing stuff, how does that sound, like I said, in relief of the changes and then eventually resolving? That is where you'll really get the most out of this slightly more advanced concept rather than just played old dominant 7. Cool. We'll see you in the woodshed.